I'm ready when you are.
Okay. Dear audience, dear distinguished speaker, Professor Stephen Angle, and dear Professor Tu Weiming and Mrs. Tu, dear colleagues and friends, welcome to the Spiritual Humanism Cyber Lecture. This is the 36th lecture, which is initiated by the Institute for Advanced Humanistic Studies at Peking University, IHS. I'm Dr. Wang Jianbao, research fellow at Chongqing Graduate School of Business, CKGSB, and also an associate researcher at IHS. IHS, 北大高研院, was founded in 2008 and inaugurated on 28th September 2010. In this month, 28th September, it will be 12 years. 北大高研院 is a research and teaching institution that specialize in academic research as well as dialogues among civilizations, deeply rooted in Chinese tradition. To deepen the self-reflexivity of Chinese traditional culture and to realize its creative developments and transformations. The founding dean of IAHS is Professor Tu Weiming, as you know. And here is the bio of Professor Stephen Angle. He's the director of the Fry Center for Global Studies, Mansfield Freeman Professor of East Asian Studies, and the Professor of Philosophy at Wesleyan University, a very, very famous and good university at the USA. Professor Angle specialized in Chinese philosophy, especially Confucianism, Neo-Confucianism, and comparative philosophy. He has many books, for example, Human Rights and Chinese Thought, a cross-cultural inquiry. The Chinese edition was published in 2012, 人权与中国思想. Sagehood, the contemporary significance of Neo-Confucian philosophy. The Chinese edition was published in the name 圣经宋明理学的当代意义 2017, as well as contemporary Confucian political philosophy toward progressive Confucianism. Many books. And today we would like to discuss his new book. The lecture name is Growing Moral, a Confucian Guide to Life. We want to discuss the progressive Confucian in the 21st century, how to live with growing moral. I think it's a time for Professor Angle to give us this lecture. Thank you very much. Please, Professor.
Thank you very much, Dr. Wang. And let me begin by apologizing to all my friends there in China tomorrow morning from my perspective, for speaking with you in English. It's been, I think, 3 years since I was in China. It's the longest time not being in China for me since I went to college, more than 30 years ago. And I just don't feel confident that I can give this lecture in Chinese. When we come to the question and answer period, I'd be happy to take questions in Chinese and do my best to answer them. Let me begin by saying how how excited I am, how honored I am to be giving a talk at the invitation of the Institute for Advanced Humanistic Study. One of my the people who's had the most profound influence on my own growth, intellectual growth and otherwise, is Professor Du Ming. In fact, the last time I was in China, I was in Beijing for a celebration of a birthday of Professor Du's, at which I gave a paper that it was a forerunner of this book that I'm talking with you about this morning. And I think that the kind of creative transformation of the Confucian tradition that Professor Du has discussed for many decades is precisely the sort of thing that I'm trying to make a small contribution to with this book. It's the first time that I've written a book that is aimed at a broad audience. It's not really aimed narrowly at scholars. And it was a wonderful experience for me to think about my own life and the experiences of others that I know, and how that can help to, in some small way, reflect what it might look like to live as a Confucian in the modern world. And in my case, primarily not in East Asia, but in the United States. So that's the sort of the broad background for this book. Let me see now if I share my screen. All right, Professor Wong, does that look like it's supposed to?
Yeah, it'll work.
Okay. Fantastic. So that's that is the title in here. It's a picture of the cover of the book. And here's an overview of what I want to share with you this evening. So first, I want to talk about the way that I am approaching my topic, what I'm calling my orienting premises. How do I think about Confucianism? And then I'm going to focus on one particularly important aspect of what I'm drawing from Confucianism, what I'm calling our starting points, and what that tells us about our possibilities for moral growth. The third section of my remarks will talk about the means of moral growth, the ways in which we can attempt to grow morally. And I will end by looking at some necessary criticisms of the past Confucian tradition. It's not only ourselves and our communities that need to grow, but the Confucian tradition itself is always in a process of growth as well. And so I'm going to talk about that. And particularly in that context, I think the debt that my way of thinking about Confucianism owes to the ideas of Professor Du, I think, will be very clear. All right, so that's the general idea. So let's start with orienting premises. So first of all, I am very much thinking about Confucianism as a very long and ongoing tradition, a tradition of philosophy, among other things. It's a tradition in which Kongzi plays obviously a very important role, but he doesn't really begin things in his own mind and in his own words. He thinks of himself as transmitting ideas of his own sort of ancestors' role in making explicit some of the central ideas of the tradition and reorienting some of the ideas. But he is not obviously a founder of this tradition in a way that other religious founders are. And the tradition also not only starts before him, but it also very much carries on after him. In my book, I focus primarily on 5 thinkers: Kongzi, Mengzi, Xunzi, Zhu Xi, and Wang Yangming. So I'm drawing on a span of about 2,000 years. But the Confucian tradition, as I'm sure all of you know, does not stop with Neo-Confucianism, nor does it limit itself to China. So in the Neo-Confucian period in particular, the Confucianism spreads to Korea, to Japan, Vietnam, and in the last 2 centuries, we've seen both enormous challenges to the continuity of Confucianism, but also exciting new frontiers as Confucianism has begun to be thought about, taken seriously, and even practiced outside of the borders of East Asia. And so it's very important to me that we think about Confucianism in this broad way as something that has grown and changed, as something that has been subject to what we can call internal criticism, that is, criticism from within the tradition, where some adherents of the tradition recognize problems, bring up problems, not just with society or with individuals, but with the ideas, some of the ideas of the tradition itself. So the tradition is changing. I think that we can identify some core ideas of the tradition that are relatively stable, but nothing is completely immune to scrutiny and perhaps criticism. I think that's the nature of a living tradition, is that it can change in this way. If it is not changing, if it's not living, well, then it's dead. Then it is no longer the sort of thing that matters to the way people live their lives. It can be interesting to people historically. We can study it in the way that we study objects in a museum. But if the tradition is not a living one, then it can't inform how we live today. So that's my first orienting premise, is to think about Confucianism as a live, changing, vital tradition. All right. So in thinking about the Confucian tradition as live and changing, I don't want to lose the idea that Confucianism is in certain ways essentially conservative. So it is very important that Confucianism orients itself to past sages, to past exemplars, to past instances of great moral and social success. We learn from our ancestors, using the word ancestors broadly. That's why in the Analects, Confucius is recorded as saying that he transmits rather than invents, right? And I think the key here is he's not inventing, as we say, out of whole cloth. He's not completely creating new ideas. Rather, he is passing on, but also clearly building on the ideas of his ancestors. And we can see quite clearly in the Analects that this idea of making changes is also something that is endorsed. So I have on the screen here famous quote from Analects 223 that speaks of the changes, the additions and subtractions that took place over the course of the early dynasties before Confucius. So this Confucian tradition that I'm referring to is something that both conserves things and also changes. So particularly when we are looking back from the standpoint of 2022, when we're looking at today at the tradition, we have to ask, well, what kind of conservation is necessary? And I think that very broadly, there are 2 different options. And these are, this is putting it simply, we don't only choose one or the other of these, but which do we focus on conserving? Do we focus on conserving the institutions and, we might say, the actual practices of the past? Or do we focus on conserving the values that were at the center of the past Confucian tradition? It seems to me the answer is that we should focus on conserving the values and conserve institutions insofar as they help us to realize the values of the tradition. But one of the reasons that what I've called progressive Confucianism might look quite different from pre-modern traditional Confucianism is because to really conserve the values of the past tradition may require some pretty significant changes to the institutions that we use to realize those values. And that's something that I'm going to be talking about as we go. This process of conserving values, of internal criticism, of rethinking what it is the Confucian tradition means to us in our day, that's not a new idea. It seems to me that this is something that Confucian thinkers have been doing ever since Kongzi. And at a certain point in the Song Dynasty, this began to be called the Daotong, the articulation or re-articulation of the tradition, emphasizing certain aspects of it and putting less emphasis on other aspects of it, because that was the way in which those thinkers thought that the Confucian tradition made the most sense in their day. So from a broad perspective, you could say that what I'm proposing here is yet another Daotong. It's a Daotong that includes thinkers like Mengzi and Xunzi, like Zhu and Wang Yangming, who in some sense disagree with one another. But I think that that's not ultimately a problem. There's a way in which we can find a thread that runs through all of their ideas. So what to conserve? We want to conserve the core values of the tradition, as I will continue to discuss. Now, I think that how to do this, how to conserve these values, becomes even more of a pressing issue as the institutions that supported traditional Confucianism, traditional imperial Confucianism, collapse around the turn of the 20th century. I think that this is the time of the greatest challenge that the Confucian tradition has ever faced in its long history. And there are many different responses. At the time, one of the most influential responses was that of Kang Youwei, who articulated what is in many ways an extremely radical understanding of Confucianism. Somewhat later, another option, another way of thinking about how to continue the Confucianism into the 20th century was offered by people who no longer had an identity through the civil service examination system and a participation in the imperial bureaucracy, but now had jobs in modern research universities, and in many cases were philosophy professors, right? That's a dramatic change in their social role. But at any rate, we have people like the so-called new Confucians, Mo Zongsan being one very prominent example, who also try to rethink what it is that Confucianism can be, what Confucianism teaches, and how it is to live as a Confucian in the modern world in the 20th century. So I put forward Kang Youwei and Mo Zongsan as two examples of thinkers who I look back to. They don't get mentioned, at least not very much, in this most recent book, but they're very much part of the way that I have thought about what it is to try to continue this tradition in the 20th and into the 21st century. Obviously, there are many others more recent still than people like Kang Youwei and Mo Zongsan, prominently among them Professor Du Weiming himself. So there's a lot more, obviously, that could be discussed about ways in which Chinese and other intellectuals have tried to conserve the Confucian tradition in the face of these great challenges. So progressive Confucianism is, I think, a broad category that suggests a way to think about the Confucian tradition as something that is undergoing ongoing development. As I've said, progressive Confucians are people who have a certain kind of acceptance of the changes of modernity. A progressive Confucian does not seek to turn back to the pre-modern era and restore institutions that made sense, possibly, if at all, in the pre-modern times and not in our own times. A progressive Confucian accepts to a significant degree that modernity has taken place. But it's a critical acceptance. So there are a lot of problems with modernity, which in all of its forms, which Confucians seek to engage with critically. As I've suggested already, progressive Confucians are people who try to conserve the core values of the Confucian tradition in a way that makes sense in the contemporary world. And I think one of the things that is central to doing so is to understand the deep relation between individual and collective that is, for me, one of the real core insights of Confucianism. And I will come back to that idea and explain a little bit more what I mean in a few minutes. All right, so that is gives you a sense of the general orientation that I am adopting in putting forward this idea of what it is to grow moral and how one might be able to live as a Confucian in the modern world. All right, so let me talk now about some of these core values that I've been talking about, some of these core ideas that seem to be at the center of Confucianism. And in doing so, I also want to recognize the tensions between different Confucian viewpoints. So the pictures on the screen here are meant to illustrate three different attitudes towards three different views on what it is that we humans start with. What do we begin with in our quest to become, ultimately to become a sage, at any rate, to become more moral than we are now? One view, that of Mengzi and many who followed him, is that we have the very beginnings of moral feelings within us, the so-called sprouts of morality, the siduan, and we don't, that is, our human nature is not neutral, it is not devoid of morality, but it is also not fully formed. We're not all already completely moral to begin with. And I'm sure this is familiar to many of you. I'd be happy to talk more about this. But I think it's worth saying that the idea that there are certain moral promptings, maybe they're weak, maybe we don't always experience them when we should, but the idea that there are certain moral feelings that we experience as part of our nature, I think this is something now that there's a great deal of scientific support for. So this view, I think, is really quite plausible. So again, on this view, we have a starting point. We have something to begin from, even though we have a lot of work to do to fully realize our moral nature. So that's the sprouts. On the right side of the screen is an illustration intending to capture something of Xunzi's view, the view that human nature is bad. Human nature is bad, not in the sense that we are inherently evil, that we want others to suffer, but rather it's bad in the sense that we just have desires for things that can never really be satisfied unless we do something to change our nature. So we always want more, and because we always want more, we end up, unless we do something about it, we end up struggling with one another in conflict and suffering results. So again, Xunzi doesn't think that we want others to suffer, but he thinks that that is an inevitable consequence of our starting point, because according to Xunzi, our starting point is neutral in a way, but bad in its outcome. Now, I think that much of what Xunzi says about human nature is actually accurate and quite compatible with what I take from what Mengzi says about human nature. But it seems to me that Xunzi is missing something important. I'd be happy to talk more about this. There are certain aspects of Xunzi's view where maybe you could say there are things that he too thinks are important moral starting points, even though he does not emphasize it. But I would prefer to say that there is something important that Xunzi's missed, but that's okay. There are places where Mengzi goes wrong as well. And what we have to do is we have to take the insights of these two different thinkers and bring them together to give us a more rich and ultimately, I think, quite well supported by modern science view of human nature. So the third view of starting points, the one according to which there's a clear direction built into us, is the view of the Neo-Confucians in different ways, of Jushi, Wang Yangming, and many other Neo-Confucians. And this is a view that I grapple with to some degree in the book, partly because I think the Neo-Confucians are so insightful in so many ways when they talk about how we should grow morally. And to some degree, their accounts depend on their view that there is built into us and everything a way for everything to fit together and flourish harmoniously. Right? That's the strong idea that the Neo-Confucians have. I think that this is an inspiring ideal. It's more complicated, maybe not impossible. There's some people who've had some really interesting thoughts about how to connect this up with certain aspects of modern science. But I think that perhaps it's best thought of as an inspiring ideal. And part of what I would think of as the religiosity of the Confucian tradition is to think of these sort of ultimate ideals of everything fitting together. And I'm happy to talk more about how sort of religiosity or the religious side of Confucianism fits together with the more philosophical, practical side that I'm putting more emphasis on as we go. So in short, I think there are three quite different views of what we start with in the tradition, and the synthesis, the way that I bring these together in the book, puts the most emphasis on Mengzi's view, but draws in certain ways on those of these other two. So we have a place to start, but it's crucial for all Confucians. And one of the reasons that I feel like I can bring together these different Confucian thinkers is because they agree on so many things. They very much agree that only if we work on ourselves can we become people who reliably answer to the moral, vital concerns that we have for one another. That's as true for Mengzi as it is for Xunzi, as it is for Jushi, as it is for Wang Yangming, as it is for that matter for Kongzi. We have to work on ourselves. And if we refuse to cultivate ourselves, we're in effect denying something about ourselves. We're letting it go. And you see this figure of somebody who's cutting a branch of a tree, but he's cutting himself off. He's gonna fall because of this. And that's what it is to deny a crucial part of yourself. If you only try to fulfill your physical desires, you're denying the care that we do have for one another, because that care that we have for one another will get ridden over. It will get, you'll no longer experience it as your physical desires become stronger and stronger. So we have to work on ourselves. Now, I acknowledge, however, that that's a very abstract kind of way to think about a motivation to change. Because to say we have to grow moral, we have to grow more moral, is to say we have to change. Each and every one of us has to work to become better tomorrow than you are today. And so we do have a starting point. There's this picture of needing to work on oneself. But I think the Confucians owe us more of a story about how we can actually be motivated to do this. Let me say a little bit about the motivations that the Confucians recognize. And I think there are a number of different types of motivation. One is what I call pushes. That is, I think that it's actually quite difficult to look in a clear-eyed way at the world around us and not feel unease, not to feel really quite concerned at climate change, warfare, and all sorts of other problems that are taking place. The enormous the effects of climate change have been so obvious, both in China and in the United States and everywhere else around the world over this past summer. Lots of suffering as a result of it. So it's impossible to actually pay attention to that and not to feel that there's a problem here, that there's as the Confucians would say, there's a disharmony. So that should push us to do something. And I think that can be a powerful motivation. But the motivations aren't only negative in that way, they're also pulls. As I put this in the book in terms of the joys that we can experience when we glimpse a kind of harmony, or you might say nascent, that is emergent harmony, when you glimpse things actually fitting together well. Sometimes that might just be in a family, sometimes it might be in a broader society, sometimes when something actually works, things fit together, people work together in a way you don't expect, you see the possibilities, and the joy that comes with that is, I think, something that also pulls people along, right? So both pushes and pulls help to motivate us. Now, even those motivations, I think, are not going to be enough for most people. Luckily, the Confucians have two more very important tools at their disposal. One, I haven't said anything about one of the most important Confucian ideas so far, which is ritual. The rituals that structure our social encounters, that structure how we engage with one another, when they are well designed, help to push us to become more moral. They help to push us to pay more attention to one another's needs, and in ways that help us to grow. And I'm going to come to some more details in a minute. So the rituals, I think, are vital. And they're also vital because they're not things that we have to choose to do just individually. One doesn't just make up rituals and decide to follow them. Rituals are things that come from one's society, that are taught to one, usually by one's elders. And they're kind of forced on you, right? When you are a child and you don't want to, whatever the ritual is, you don't want to wait to eat at the dinner table until your parents have been served. Well, if you grab the food because you're hungry, you're going to be scolded and made to wait. And so on. So there's a way in which that enables rituals to serve this motivating role, whether we like it or not. And then there's another kind of support that comes from outside us, which is support from friends, from family, people who are enthusiastic and encouraging us to grow. I think ideally this is a key part of the relationship one has with one's parents. It's a key part of the relationship one has with one's spouse, and with friends and so on. So there are a whole variety of ways I think in many of these things, the Confucians have extremely insightful remarks to make about how it is we can actually be pushed and pulled and supported in our efforts to build on our moral starting points. So the goal, the ultimate goal, is to become a sage. Are any of us sages? Well, no, probably not. Have there been sages? Maybe. Maybe there's been real sages. It's striking that the Confucian tradition almost always refers to sages as in the distant past, where it doesn't really matter very much whether they were as perfect as perhaps sage, a full-grown, full-on sage needs to be. I think the ideal of the sage is extremely important, and it's important that it's possible. But I also think it's not very important whether anyone ever actually becomes a sage, because what's important is that we grow better. What's important is that we get closer to being a sage. And the Confucian tradition very explicitly recognizes this. They talk about different stages of growth. And so wherever you are, there is a stage that is higher up. There's still, you have room to grow, but you can also feel good that you have grown as far as you've grown. And what it is to be an even better person than you are now is, in an important sense, continuous with what it is to be the person you are now. Even a sage is ultimately concerned with the same kinds of things that you are right now. So having robust relations with family and friends, caring about one's society, and so on, all of these are things that we feel to some degree, and sages feel more purely, right? So I think these are all reasons why the ideal of the sage is important to understand, but we don't have to sort of obsess about whether anyone is actually a sage. It's the progress towards sagehood that matters. Let me say a little bit about the whether sagehood is actually possible. This is something that I've had many conversations with people about over the years. There's a very good book by an American philosopher named Owen Flanagan called Varieties of Moral Personality. Flanagan is a terrific philosopher, in part because he is very open-minded and interested in all sorts of different philosophical traditions. And he's also interested in what can be learned from psychology and other sciences. So he's a philosopher, but he's drawing on all sorts of different sources. And there's a point in this wonderful book when he suggests that perfection, being a perfectly moral person, is not possible. And I think this is one of the few places in the book where he goes astray, where he leads us astray, because he acknowledges that you can imagine responding perfectly to a situation, and maybe you can even imagine responding perfectly to several situations. But he feels like it just is impossible to imagine someone who never goes wrong, who always responds perfectly. And it seems to me that that's not a very strong argument. If we can imagine one time and 3 times and 5 times, why can't we imagine always, even if we think it's highly unlikely? Here's another way to put the same point. There are some really fascinating and kind of bizarre stories about the ancient sage Shun and his relations with his brother and his father in the Mengzi. His brother and his father are very bad to him. They try to kill him, and he nonetheless continues to love them. And I think that it's easy to conclude that that's not possible. How could anyone treat horrible, relatives like Shun had in this loving way that Shun did? Well, I ask you this. Probably all of us have at least one relative who's annoying, who frustrates us. But you certainly know some people, whether this is you or not, you certainly know some people who are nonetheless able to still care for this annoying relative. Maybe hoping that if we care for them, if we show them love, that they will become less annoying, less frustrating. That's easy to imagine anyways. And I think it's true for many of us that we're able to love a somewhat annoying relative. Well, if we can do that, then why couldn't some just paragon of human virtue, some very, very rare person like Shun, actually love a relative who is as bad and nasty as Shun's father and brother? So all of this seems to me to be possible. I'm not even that concerned if you don't agree. Because again, the actual achievement of sagehood is not what I'm talking about. It's the growth towards sagehood. It's pruning the tree of oneself in a way that it gets more and more flourishing, even if it never reaches perfection. All right, moving on now to part 3. The way that we prune our moral tree, to use the metaphor I was just offering. Well, so far I've been summarizing some of the key ideas in the book, but I haven't given you a very clear sense of what's actually in the book, more specifically. So I'll spend just a little while on this slide here, but this gives you a number of the chapters in the book. So the book is, as I said at the beginning, written for a general audience. That means the chapters are very short. They're, I think, rather easy to read. They use examples from real life. And the chapters in part 2 of the book, so that part 1 is sort of an introduction, gives you a sense of who we're dealing with. Part 2, the chapters are listed on the left-hand side of the screen here. At least some of the chapters, there are a few others, but these are some of the chapters. So there's a chapter telling readers what it is to follow rituals. There's a chapter telling readers how to read in the way that Confucians recommend. There's a chapter saying, listen to the right music, and talks about what that means and why listening to the right music is important. There's a chapter instructing readers to reflect in a Confucian way, to pay attention in a Confucian way, and to engage sociopolitically in the way that Confucians recommend. So each of these chapters in part 2 of the book draws on texts, quotes Confucians, but also updates it in a way so that we can see what it is to do these things that the Confucians call on us to do in our contemporary lives. And then part 3 of the book, Aspects of Moral Growth, looks not at specific different things that we should do, but looks more over the lifespan. So I talk about what commitment is and why it's important to make a commitment and then to deepen that commitment over time. I talk about the way in which the slogan in English is fake it until you make it, forcing yourself to do something at first, but eventually it becoming more and more easy and spontaneous. I talk about that over time, as we are growing morally, we are expanding our sense of self. I talk about different stages of achievement and ultimately about how we deal with death. So that gives you a broad sense of many of the topics that come up in the book. And what I want to do now is dive in a little more deeply into one of them, into the chapter on reading. So here's a quote that I think could have been written by many contemporary teachers. I think that there are many Americans who are concerned about our educational system and the way that the educational system is designed to just get you to do well on a test rather than teaching you in a deeper way. I believe there are probably many Chinese with similar sorts of concerns. And if you have that kind of concern, you might say this. You might say the books you should read, the books you read should be embodied in your person. I don't know whether what you routinely study is on your mind at all times or not. But if it isn't, if you're just hurrying through the texts, reading for their literal meaning and taking little pleasure in them, then this, I fear, will be of no benefit to you in the end. All right? So who said this? Well, Jushi said this in the 12th century. But it seems to me, as I say, that this is something that we can identify with. We can understand why this is a concern. Certainly it was a concern for Jushi that people studying for the civil service examinations were hurrying through the texts, reading for their literal meaning and taking little pleasure in them. That's not how he wanted us to approach our reading. He wanted us, he says, to read for inspiration, to read in a way that is ultimately going to change us, not just allow us to do well on a text. On a test. In the book, I include this quote from the Ming Dynasty thinker Yu Bi, who I think is really nicely illustrates the kind of reading that Jushi is talking about. So Wu Yubi describes himself. This is a passage from Wu Yubi's diary. He wrote, "This evening, slowly walking through the fields, I was silently chanting passages from the Zhongyong, from the Doctrine of the Mean. I took my time going over each word and phrase, chanting them with great feeling. Realized in my heart-mind, verified in my experience, this book has given me a great deal of insight." Right? That's the kind of reading and the result of reading that Jushi is talking about. So it involves chanting, repeating, reading slowly, reading carefully, and so on and so forth. I'm going to talk a little bit more about what goes on here. Right? This is very different from just trying to memorize a few facts so that you can do well on a test. Now, it's also the case that Jushi wants us to read critically. He wants us to question what we read, and he wants us to question how we understand what we're reading. And I think this idea of reading critically goes all the way back to Mengzi. So in a really fascinating passage, Mengzi writes, "In explaining an ode, one should not allow the words to obscure the sentence, nor the sentence to obscure the author's commitment. The right way to get it is to use one's righteousness to meet the author's commitment." All right? So what Mengzi is trying to get us to do when we're reading is ultimately to understand something about, in a way, the character of the author of the text that we're reading. Understand something about what that author is committed to morally. And the right way to do that is to use one's own morality, to use one's righteousness, one's sense of what's right and wrong, to meet the author's commitment. Right? And if one gets bogged down in the words, then one has made a mistake. Right? So again, reading is ultimately about inspiration. It's about changing us. It's about motivating us. So that should take us back to some of the earlier things that I said about how we're trying to motivate ourselves to change. Reading plays a critical role in that process. So one way to summarize Jushi's approach to reading is to say that there are 4 steps. There are different ways of breaking this up, but I think that this is one plausible way. The first is to recite the text. repeatedly, so to really get familiar with the text. The second step, which begins to happen as you become familiar with it, is to reflect on it, to question it, to reflect on what it means, to think about how it's related to you, to question whether you're understanding it correctly, right? So that's a process that goes on, and obviously something that could take place in conversation with others. The third step is to try to work at embodying what you are finding in the text. So if it just remains some abstract ideas that you have learned, then you have not gone far enough. When you think about what the ways in which the things you read relate to your own life, that should lead you to change how you're living, right? So embodying the text means thinking about how it really should affect the way you live. And so the ultimate goal of Zhu Xi's reading is going beyond the text. As he says, ultimately, book learning is of secondary importance. Book learning is not the most important thing for Zhu Xi or for any Confucian. The most important thing is changing ourselves. So I think that's a pretty accurate summary of what Zhu Xi tells us about reading. Here are some questions that you might ask yourself, and I'd be happy to talk more about this in a little while, if you like. But ask yourself, do we ever actually read in this way? When was the last time you read something in this way, if ever? So that's one question. And a second question is, well, what sorts of things could we or should we read in this way? Is it everything that should be read this way? Probably not. But what sorts of texts? For Zhu Xi, it's of course in the first instance, it's the Confucian classics. Should we be reading the Confucian classics in that way? To be a Confucian, must you read the Confucian classics in this way? A third question, and right, I'm a teacher, can this be incorporated into the way we teach? Can this be incorporated into a class or in some other way into our lives? And I think that the answer is to some degree that it can, but it's somewhat complicated, I will grant. But I think that there are ways which we can incorporate many of these ideas into the ways we teach in the classroom. And then what are some of the challenges that might come from trying to read in this way? Well, so those are some questions for you to think about. I'm going to try to pick up on that last question about some of the challenges to reading in this Confucian way. And I would identify 3 different challenges, which I'll give them fancy names: subjectivism, scholasticism, I can't even say it myself, scholasticism, and institutionalization. So subjectivism is the idea that we are sort of subjective in what we find in a text, right? I find one thing there, you find something else there. Well, if that's the case, then how can the kind of reading that Zhu Xi is talking about actually lead to some kind of goal of becoming more moral? Maybe what you find in the text leads you to become less moral, right? So subjectivism seems like a concern. Scholasticism is the worry that we just get bogged down in texts. That ultimately all we care about is reading text, writing text, commenting on texts, and that reading in this super detailed way does not lead to moral growth. And the third challenge that I see here is, suppose that you decided there are some answers to these other questions, and that maybe a well-motivated individual could do this kind of thing. How do we actually institutionalize that, right? How do we make that into a broader practice that helps other people in our society? So I think all 3 of these are big questions. but I'm going to give a brief and provocative answer to the question, which is to wonder whether something like the practice of liberal education, as it is more or less realized, particularly I think at small colleges in the United States, whether that is something close to the kind of reading that Jushi is talking about. I think that it's interesting that, so this quote comes from a book by Michael Roth. Michael Roth is the president of my university, and also an important thinker about liberal education. And here's what he says. He says, in campus cultures where being smart means being a critical unmasker, students may become too good at showing how things can't possibly make sense. They may close themselves off from their potential to find or create meaning and direction from the books, musics, and experiments they encounter in the classroom. Now, that's not quite Jushi, but I think the idea that we should be finding meaning and direction in the books we encounter in the classroom is somewhere in the vicinity of what Jushi is talking about. So an education that simply is cramming facts into your head that you spit back when you take a test, that is not a Confucian education. An education where it's all about critical thinking in the sense that Michael Roth is criticizing here is not a Confucian education. But an education in which there is a creative encounter, a sort of direct and sustained encounter with great works, it maybe could be something more like a Confucian reading practice. And I will say that one of the comments that I have received from students that I most value is, well, so this first happened my very first year teaching at Wesleyan, something like 28 or 29 years ago. And I was teaching a course on Neo-Confucianism. I was actually teaching about Jushi. I had about 25 students in the class. And after one class session, a student came up to me and said, Professor Angle, I wanted to tell you that your class is the most relevant class that I'm taking in college. And I was rather surprised to hear that. But as I thought about it, I was also very pleased because it seemed like what was going on for this student and hopefully others was that as we were reading these texts, in fact, reading Jushi and other texts, students were taking the time to read closely, read carefully. We were talking about what it meant, how it related to their own lives. And they were finding that to be very helpful, maybe producing some insight. So I do think that this kind of teaching, this kind of reading with something like the Confucian goal is possible in the contemporary world. All right. So far, I've been very positive about Confucianism. As I move to a close, I want to note that there are problems in the Confucian tradition, and that for the tradition itself to grow, we need to take these problems seriously. I just want to return again to this idea that traditions, when they are healthy, when they are alive, are things that evolve, things that change in positive ways. Alistair McIntyre, who is a great American historian of philosophy and ethicist, has written very insightfully about what traditions are and about the fact that they need to grow. Ironically, he looks a little bit like the picture that's on the screen, but of course that's not Alistair McIntyre, that's Feng Youlan. And Feng Youlan, the very important 20th century intellectual historian and philosopher, makes a distinction that I think is relevant to the approach to the tradition that I'm talking about here with you today. And that is the need to continue a tradition rather than simply following it. Now, who gets to decide what counts as a proper continuation, creative transformation of a tradition? That's a very good question. Ultimately, it seems to me that it's only the Confucians themselves, or maybe, if you'll forgive me, I'll say it's only the Confucians ourselves who get to decide. But there's no simple way that happens. It's a matter of dialogue and debate over time. So anyways, that's a tricky question, and I'd be happy to talk more about that. But so when there's this question of, well, how do you decide where should we go? Let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. So I'm going to talk about gender and gender oppression. It seems to me, uncontroversial to say, even though it's unfortunate in my view, but uncontroversial to say that the mainstream view of gender in the Confucian tradition, particularly in the last 1,000 years of the Confucian tradition, but this is true even before then, is that women are limited to the inner sphere, are not able to participate in the outer sphere. They are limited to so-called female virtues. So there's a set of virtues that are appropriate for women, distinctively for women, which are different from the virtues for men, and that women cannot aspire to sagehood. Many, many Confucian thinkers say all these things. All right, so I think that this is just uncontroversially what the mainstream of the tradition says. Now, there are exceptions, of course. There are a small number of very interesting exceptions to this over the centuries. And what I would like to emphasize today is the Nei Xun, or Teachings for the Inner Court, written by the Ming Dynasty Empress Ren Xiaowen. And in this text, Empress Ren Xiaowen makes explicit that no, in her view, women have the same human nature as men. Women can develop the very same virtues: benevolence, righteousness, propriety, wisdom, and yi li zhi. Women can become sages. She's 100% clear on this. And so the Empress's views differ from the mainstream of the Confucian tradition, although she very much sees herself within that Confucian tradition. I have to say, I think that her grounds for arguing this are very, very strong. The idea that women can only aspire to female virtues and women can't become sages and so on and so forth, it's not something that you find really in the classics in any sort of explicit way, even if it's maybe sometimes assumed. So I think that the Empress's views here are very, very plausible, but they're also a very small minority. And even Empress Ren Xiaowen acknowledges the limitation to the inner. So she says, yes, women can become sages, but the way that they do that is by being an inner helpmate to their husbands, who are the ones acting in the outer world. Here she, of course, is thinking about her husband, the emperor. So this is better than the mainstream, but still is not what I would think of as a fully embracing the humanity of women. So in my view, a modern progressive Confucian is going to go beyond even what Ren Xiaowen argued here, and in fact demonstrate that women, yes, have the same human nature, that women can develop the same virtues, that women can become sages, and they can do this in any of the contexts that men can. So men and women are different from one another in certain ways. Different men are different from one another in different ways, as different women are different from one another in different ways. I think that the many different ways in which we are similar to one another and different from one another, the many ways in which we are actually changing over time in our attitudes, that I'd say, I mean, a given individual over their lifetime, given who they encounter and so on and so forth, can play very different roles, and so on. All of that is actually what the Chinese tradition should have led us to expect. And in the book, I talk a little bit, I don't really go into this very far, but in the book, I talk a little bit about the Book of Changes. I talk about the I Ching and the way in which the I Ching should have suggested that we think about gender. We, of course, also have to think about our gender, our ideas of gender in the context of relationships. And I've written an article that talks about the relationships between spouses, and what it is a modern progressive Confucian would envision in terms of a spousal relationship. In brief, I think it's one where we make our own individual and changing contributions to a relationship over time. All right, so how are we doing? Okay, pretty well. And yeah, so I'm going to end just by putting some more questions onto the screen here, and then I'll stop the share, and we'll be interested in hearing your comments and questions. So these are some questions that some people have asked me. I think I have answers to these questions, but I'm not going to say more about answering them right now, just to recognize that this is an ongoing conversation. And I think that the question of what it really is to continue to develop the Confucian tradition in the most constructive way possible into the 21st century, not only in Beijing and around China, but in other parts of the world, even including the United States. I think this is an ongoing question, something that scholars are continuing to talk about, but I think it's also time for that conversation to become much broader, because ultimately the questions aren't just questions that scholars need to answer, but questions that we need to answer individually for ourselves about how Confucianism can bring meaning to our own lives. So that is what I have to share with you. And I would be very happy to take questions.
Thank you very much. Yeah, it's a great speech. I'm very impressed. So, Professor Angle, you can take a break, have a cup of tea. Yeah. Actually, Professor Tu and Ms. Tu is also on the line to listen to your great speech since the beginning. Yeah, and we are very honored to have this opportunity. Yeah. I know you are from the Wesleyan University. It's so dignified, and you have a very good alumni. His name is T.S. Eliot, if I remember right. Yeah, he's a Nobel Prize winner, and he has a good concept is called individual talent. And Professor Tu mentioned a couple of times to us, any tradition will be inherited or conserved or transformed or transmitted by individual talent. That's the first problematic for your speech at the very beginning. So, you know, the individual talent is inevitably a living concrete person here and now. So we are various from each other. So during this transformation and conservation, like you mentioned also Feng Youlan and Zhu Xi, Wang Yangming, as well as since the very beginning, Duke Zhou and Confucius himself, their different understanding of the text of the 6 classical books will be relying on different individual talent. So in that case, the question is whether we are facing some kind of dialectic theology or crisis theology of the contemporary Confucian school, or we can say Confucianism. But if you put the ISM, everything will be changed. Since you also mentioned the religiosity, so the religiousness of Confucianism, regarding this living Confucian in the 21st century. So how can we develop this great tradition or kind of crisis theology of Confucianism on the other side, on the negative side? And like Debarry said, the Confucian trouble is the human being trouble. So if we can solve the problems simultaneously for Confucianism herself, as well as the human being survival. So that's also articulated by Professor Zhu Min, that Confucianism is kind of local value with the global significance. So I want to know more from your side regarding this kind of worries or concerns, or how to say optimistic attitude or pessimistic attitude. We don't know, since everything is ambiguous, yeah, and uncertain.
So thank you. I think that perhaps the greatest challenge facing individual Confucians, if you like, what is calling for individual talent to really answer right now is to use a modern, updated version of Confucianism to respond to problems in our local societies and in the globe. I think that it's important, of course, for Confucian scholars to think about the interpretation of ancient texts and so on and so forth. But I think that for the health of Confucianism, the most important thing is for Confucians to speak up as Confucians in their societies about challenges that their societies are facing, or the world is facing, and the ways in which, as Confucians, they are offering solutions to those problems. And so, you know, I think that one of the perhaps most outspoken people who working in this mode, in speaking as a Confucian to world problems and to other perspectives around the world, has indeed been Professor Du, right? Most contemporary Confucians focus is really on Confucian scholarship. And of course, you can't set the scholarship aside. But if Confucians are not able to act and speak as as thinkers, as I don't know, we call public intellectuals in their societies, then I think that the future for Confucianism is really very dim, because it's only by making Confucianism live outside of the classroom, outside of the library, that it can really grow, that we can, I ask, how do we decide whether Confucianism should be the kind of sort of embracing of gender equality in the way that I was suggesting and Professor Du himself has suggested, or should maybe go backwards and be more what I would call being oppressive? How do we decide which is actually the Confucianism for the future? It's not just a matter of looking in books. It's got to be how we live our lives. And so I think I hope that resonates with the kind of question that you're asking, because I think you're really pointing at something really important.
Thank you very much for your encouragement. I think we are very lucky today that Professor Tu is also on the line personally. I think he would like to say something to enlighten us. Professor Tu, are you?
I may.
Yeah, no problem. So he
low power， 啊？
或者是把灯打开吧。Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Steve, for your inspiring speech. And I totally agree with you that one of the major challenges of the Confucian tradition is to embrace gender equality. I would say if the Confucian tradition, both in terms of individual talents and in terms of the cumulative tradition, is not able to respond creatively, responsively to the challenge of the feminist question, and then the ability of the tradition to survive as a source of inspiration for people in many traditions would be greatly diminished. And I think you're absolutely right that progressive Confucianism takes it for granted that gender equality is not simply an ideal. It is a human necessity for human flourishing for everyone. It is this particular notion of being an integral part of not only heaven and earth, the myriad things, integral part of the human community as a whole, that the tradition will be able to survive and flourish. So I do appreciate very much you are putting the emphasis on reading the classics as embodying the message. And one way of embodying the message is truly to understand the limitation of the practical practice of the tradition for so long, both politically and socially, that it's not able to embrace gender equality, the respect for the other in this connection is not simply a matter of taste, a matter of choice. It is imperative that the tradition embrace gender equality. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. It's so wonderful to see you looking so well. It's been too long, and literally the last time I was in China was there visiting you. So it's great to see you well. Thank you for those comments. I of course you agree with me because I'm really just repeating back what you have said in many ways on this subject. So this is, you know, we have many of us taken so much inspiration from you on this subject, and you know, the idea that I think that when we immerse ourselves in these texts and think about them in an open-minded way from a contemporary perspective, right? It's not just that we have to, the idea is not that we have to compromise the key ideas of the tradition in order for it to survive. I think it's rather that to genuinely realize the key ideas of the tradition, it has to continue to grow and change in the way that leads it to embrace gender equality, right? Yeah, so thank you so much. I couldn't agree more.
Okay. Actually, the gender issues are common depressions for all the X-age civilizations, as well as common challenges for our modern societies, no matter in the Hebrew or Hellenic traditions or in Confucian or Hindu traditions. So we all facing the transformation challenge. Otherwise, we cannot be actively responsive or responsible for the coming ethical lives. Like you show on your presentation, the just married picture. It's very shocking for us, and but it's to be understood with a certain tolerance to some extent. Yeah, and I think we have collected several questions on the way, and some audience has raised their hands, and maybe we can use a bilingual language to communicate. If you like, you know, you can practice your Chinese, and I can practice my English as well. So,
应该没问题。如果有些朋友要用中文问问题，请我如果听不懂，我就请王老师帮忙。
is a big challenge for me. You know, the translation of Confucian classics are very flexible, are very open. It's not like the Bibles with some kind of imperial version, or English version, German version, and so forth. For the Confucian classics, we are still on the way with very diversified interpretations of all the lines of all the texts. So you know, we mentioned your great alumni, Thomas Eliot. Actually, he has a big mentor, Ezra Pound. So Ezra Pound has penetrated a little bit on the book Zhongyong, the meaning of doctrine, but in a very simple way. So Professor Tu was inspired by his thinking of by Ezra Pound. So that's why he wrote that book, 中庸洞见. So regarding so like the Ezra Pound, Thomas Eliot, as well as Tu Weimin, the dialogues are there between the West and the East, and owing to this kind of constructive dialogues, both sides benefit from each other, including Confucianism. For Eliot, his great poem, like The Wasteland, is very popular in China. Almost every middle school student can recite a couple of lines. But for the the meaning of doctrine, I think, is not popular like the waste of land in the Western world. So I think it's kind of two directions communications between the West and the East. And but I don't know, it's due to the historical background or due to the language issue. We could how to promote more the dialogues among civilizations, you know, to be more harmonized or to be more peaceful for the human being society.
Well, the first step should be no more COVID. If we get rid of the pandemic, then we can visit again. It's so difficult to travel now. It's wonderful that we have technology like Zoom, and so we can, you know, we can communicate in this way. It's of course even better when we can be together.
Yeah. Pandemic lasted 3 years. It's kind of a Chinese saying. So the big epidemic or pandemic can only last 3 years. I understand you. So we will be very optimistic. Yeah. So you mentioned that we not feel unease. You know, so many disasters, miserable and pitiable things happened. Mencius emphasized all the times that you have been shocked by so many tragedies, but still you should maintain or recall the human nature is good. But you mentioned, that's the another side you mentioned, is not in harmony with your friends or with the people around you. So that comes to the question that Thomas Mercer, you also quoted a couple of lines from his book. Yeah, his question is, we are always optimistic as a living Confucian all the time. So due to this optimistic attitude, maybe Confucian cannot really, how to say, recognize the challenges and solve the problems. So how to respond to Mo Zike? This also mentioned by Professor Tu a couple of times regarding his great book. Yeah.
So I think that the Mo Zike, the Metzger, he sees enormous value in Confucianism, but he also sees a problem. And the value is the optimism. The problem is also the optimism. That is, he thinks that there is an extreme kind of optimism in the Confucian tradition, that it's this idea that it's possible to be a sage, that we can find sages to lead us, and the sages will tell us the answers. So we don't have to work them out for ourselves. We can just sort of sit around passively and wait for a sage to solve our problems. And the other side of that is when someone claims to be a sage, and especially a political leader claims to be a sage, Metzger sees this problem that Confucians sometimes just passively accept that. So in his analysis, Confucians are opposed to using the rule of law and having lawyers debate about things. Confucians are opposed to democracy and competition between different people to try to convince others to support them. He sees this optimism as leading to a resistance to the messy world of actual politics. And I think there's some truth to this, and you can see ways in which different Confucians over the centuries and even in the 20th century have sometimes shied away from being involved in politics because it gets messy. It's difficult to be morally pure and to be a politician, right? So I think it's a really insightful challenge. For me, as I emphasized in my talk today, on the one hand, the possibility of sagehood is very important. But on the other hand, the fact that we do not know who is a sage, we can never know, right? There's no way to know for sure that somebody is a sage. And therefore, that tells us things actually about how we should design our political system. Once again, another I think great insight of Professor Du's was to write that it's in a democracy that the Confucian ideas of virtue have the best chance of really being realized. And I think that's right. And so this particular book does not talk as much about politics and political philosophy as some of my other books have. But I do think that the way to answer Metzger is by recognizing that one way that the Confucian tradition has to be updated, has to update itself, is to embrace gender equality. Another way that the Confucian tradition has to update itself in order to better realize its own core values is by embracing the rule of law and democracy. Because those things, just like gender equality, is essential because it helps people become moral. It helps women become moral. It helps men become moral. The same is true of democracy. It's not a simple thing. Democracy is complicated, but the being involved politically and socially in your society is a crucial part of being a more mature, more moral person. If you just sit back and passively let somebody else take care of everything, that does not help you to understand the importance of other people's perspectives. It does not help you to grow yourself to be more inclusive in the way that Confucians call for. So, I think that the details of what sort of politics are necessary, we could debate, but active political engagement, active social engagement is crucial for moral growth. And I think that means that if you think that any kind of impurity, any kind of like argument with others and engaging in the real world makes you less virtuous. It's kind of sort of what Metzger suggests. I think that the opposite is true. That we need that kind of engagement because ultimately the world is a complicated place, and if there is some kind of harmony, right? If we can realize the Tao somehow, it's not going to be just a simple, obvious way. It's going to require some really subtle balancing and some careful understanding of many different perspectives.
Good. Yeah. Thank you very much for your very insightful response. We have several questions from our audience because some audience maybe didn't recognize they can raise questions in Chinese. but also in English, both welcomed. Professor Hong Li, she's from 中国传媒大学, maybe if I remember right. She wants to ask some questions. Hong Li, can you? Okay, please go ahead. Yeah.
Hello. Yes. Thank you, Professor Stephen Engel, and thank you for your wonderful speech. Yes, my name is Hong Li. I'm from Communication University of China. So I have two very small questions. Okay, very impressed about when you're talking about the motivation to cultivate oneself, and you brought forth a concept about push and pulls. I did not get so clearly about this concept, especially about the pools, and when you said about the joy of nascent harmony. So would you elaborate? Maybe I missed that part. I'm sorry for that. This is the one. The other one is that I was very impressed when you say one of the students would say, express his gratitude for your lecture or for your courses, and you were very pleased. And I can feel that because I'm myself a teacher in the university. So my question is that to what extent can you just influence more students? I mean, in America, and more. I recognize that because I was told that there's only a small group of people who are really interested in Chinese philosophy, especially Confucianism. And it's a hard work, I mean, to let it widespread, because I guess that you are quite have this like solid belief on Confucius teaching, but as a professor, and how to make yourself and your understanding more influential to your students or a large group of students, and maybe in the future a kind of a collaborative discussion between American students and Chinese students, I mean young generations. And although I mean we cannot see each other face to face, but we can make it happen like in the Zoom meeting and whatever. And due to maybe we would like to thank Mr. Wang Jianbo to give us such a good opportunity for the interactions on the internet. I mean, by internet. Yes, thank you very much.
Please.
Okay. Yes. Thank you, Professor Hong. I think that so let me see if I can answer both of these questions. In terms of the pull motivation, I did not spend very much time on it, so I don't think you missed anything. This is actually one of the places in the book where I connect up most directly with some Neo-Confucian ideas, and even some of the poetry of the Song Dynasty Confucians, because I don't know. Well, before I say that, I think that the experience of, often it's brief, but the experience of feeling connected with something broader than yourself. It isn't necessarily with the entire cosmos. It might just be with, I don't know, there are moments walking around the quite beautiful campus of Wesleyan University, especially at night when there's the moon out and lights on and so on, when I have had this experience of feeling like I'm part of something, which includes my students, my colleagues. It includes the whole community that hosts our university, and you can feel connections beyond that. And so partly what I'm talking about, I think, is an experience that we do have in various different contexts. Other people may experience it more when they're out in nature, have climbed a mountain. But this So this feeling of actually being connected physically, emotionally. So I think it's that in these small ways, we can begin to get a sense of what it is that the Neo-Confucians talk about when they describe this feeling of, what Wang Yangming calls forming one body with all things, right? And that's a abstract metaphysical idea, but it's also, I think, a genuine kind of experience. And so that's I think the broader, more positive side of connection, which can be experienced in a lot of different ways. And if I feel like that sense of joy that one can feel in these different kind of contexts is really very important, because if all we're doing is sort of fleeing from the bad things, if we don't have a sense of what we're trying to move towards, then I think that moral growth is going to be much less sustainable, right? We want something that, because if you're only ever motivated by trying to fix bad things, that's very hard to sustain. I think ultimately people get tired of that sort of work. Charity workers and so on can do wonderful things, but eventually you stop caring because it's just too hard. So we need a positive side as well. So the question about relevance and how do we broaden the appeal of Confucianism, I think, is a great question. One of the things that I discuss in the book is a comparison with the really very significant success in China of the growth of American Buddhism. So something like, I don't know, I think it's 3 or 4% of Americans identify as Buddhists. And that means, many, many tens of thousands of Americans identify as Buddhists. I don't know what the exact number is, and of course it changes. But it's quite significant. Here in the small town that I live in, we have more than one Buddhist temple that people belong to and participate in. So there's many different varieties. There's nothing like that for Confucianism in the United States at this point. And there are interesting questions about why that is. I think that as people learn what Confucianism is really about, they become very interested. And one example of that, so with 2 colleagues and I in the philosophy department here at Wesleyan have been teaching over the last 3 years a large course called Living a Good Life. And we use both ancient Greek and ancient Chinese texts. And we also, in addition to the students reading the texts, the students also have what we call philosophical exercises. So there's a Live Like Confucius week, where each day for 7 days, there are certain exercises that the students have to do in their lives and then write about. And similarly with Aristotle, we have a Live Like Zhuangzi week, actually, and a Live Like a Stoic week. So they both read the texts and so on and do more traditional work. Also they do these, what we call experiments in living. So this has been very popular at Wesleyan, about 100 students per semester, per year, which for us is very big. And then we did an online version of this class for just anybody who was interested last January. We went on for 7 weeks, last January and February. And we had 4,000 people register for the class and take part. So I think there is an audience as people sort of learn more. But the key is, I think that most people in the United States, unfortunately, when they hear Confucius, they think of just short cryptic sayings that don't make any sense. They think of if they've been to a Chinese restaurant and gotten fortune cookies, and the little, that's what Confucius is to them. So we have a lot of work to do to educate people, but as they learn, they become more interested.
Good, good.
Yeah, thank you so much for your questions.
And thank you, wonderful share. Yeah, of the teaching. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much.
Mr. Wang.
There are a couple of questions at the WeChat room. First is one of our friends named Chen Jun. I don't know is a lady or gentleman. During the 20th century, 儒家思想研究建立了各种不同类型的理论体系。但是儒家不只是学术流派，还具有宗教性质 （religious）。question： 儒家思想在未来的文化走向中，是否有望形成现代意义上的新儒教？
So the question is whether for Confucianism to continue into the future, it needs to be remade as a new sort of religion. Is that right? Not just a intellectual tradition or philosophical tradition, but it needs to be thought of as a religion. And to some degree, I think that's true. Whether, in what way Confucianism is a religion depends a lot on what we mean by religion. I think that many people in the West, and in my experience, many people in China as well, think of religion quite narrowly. Think of religion as about belief in God, and some kind of God, at least. And I don't think that that is a very good model for talking about Confucianism as a religion, or talking about the religiosity of Confucianism. I don't think that I don't think that we should understand Confucian religion in terms of, let's say, belief in Tian. It seems to me that this model of believing in some supernatural thing as a source of guidance, as a source of morality, is not the right. That's a very Western model of a narrow model of what religion is. On the other hand, the idea that Confucianism is something that we should embrace wholeheartedly with our body and mind, or let's say our heart mind, our shin, right? That it should inform the way we practice. That it should inform our sense of values, that we should think of the world as full of values that can potentially all be brought together in a harmonious way. Those are all ideas that can be thought about religiously, seems to me, if we just open our minds to what religion is. So I don't think that Confucianism needs priests. I don't think that Confucianism needs a strict set of beliefs. But I do think that Confucianism needs practices, it needs deep values. It's not just something that philosophy professors should talk about to other philosophy professors. Right? So yes, ultimately, I think that the sort of the religion side is important because it's what connects Confucianism to practice. but we should not think of religion on the model of Christianity.
Great. This is a very critical question, but your answer is quite constructive and successful. Second one, 利润之轮对所有人说，安老师，你在访谈中谈到您的博士论文是梁启超关于儒家的公德私德，最近这个挺热的，您能不能谈谈这方面 ？First， 还有就是关于儒家伦理定位的问题，有美德伦理、义务伦理、角色伦理、后果伦理，您怎么看？Two big questions.
Okay. Well, boy, my PhD dissertation, it was a long time ago. So let me say this. So it's true that my PhD dissertation was mostly about Liang Qichao and how to. I was very interested in Liang Qichao because he stands right at this enormous transition moment. The sort of changes that I briefly talked about in my talk today, where the Confucian tradition was undergoing enormous changes. China was undergoing enormous changes, and the question of how you think about a tradition as things are changing so rapidly, how different civilizations or different cultures, moralities and moral ideas can relate to one another, how it's possible to communicate across different languages and cultural barriers. Those are all the sorts of things that I explore in my dissertation. And I think that Liang Qichao actually gives us a wonderful example of someone who is, he does not write long theoretical treatises, but I think that he's really a very thoughtful, creative philosopher who is really thinking creatively about how traditional Chinese ideas make sense in this new world and how they relate to the ideas of Kant. So so that's, that was why I was so inspired to look at Liang Qichao, and I think that one of the question was specifically about what I found about his ideas of gongde and side, right? So gongde is particularly famous and is at the center of his Xinmin Shuo. But I was really interested in the fact that he also emphasizes what he called side, which was sort of more of the traditional Confucian individual virtues, right? So he wasn't only saying that our role as citizen in relationship to the nation was important. He was recognizing that that sort of role has to be combined with our responsibilities to family, to one another, and so on and so forth in a more traditional Confucian way. So I think that, in many ways, Liang Qichao's, at least some of his writings, point the way towards a modern progressive Confucianism. So that was, I think, what excited me so much about that. And then, right, so one of the things that I've always been interested, going back to my dissertation and ever since, is thinking about how different philosophical traditions can communicate with one another, how different cultures can communicate with one another. And so the second question had to do with this idea of the different sorts of models of ethics. In English we would say virtue ethics, the 美德伦理学, or deontological ethics, the 义务论, and so on. And it seems to me that as we realize, the more we learn about Confucianism, and the more open-minded philosophers become about what sorts of ways of understanding morality are available, we realize that moral philosophers in the West have a great deal to learn from Confucianism and other world traditions. And I think that, moral philosophers in the West for a long time thought there were only two options. There was utilitarianism and there was Kantianism, right? And it's only really in the last few decades that moral philosophers in the West have rediscovered Aristotle and are starting to realize that there are more ways to think about virtue than just Aristotle. And I think noting the way in which virtue is so central for for the early Confucians, but also for the Neo-Confucians, is very broadening. So I would say that we should understand Confucian ethics on the model of a virtue ethics, but not on the model of Aristotle. Aristotle is one other kind of virtue ethics. So virtue ethics is a broad category, and I think it's the category that best fits what's going on with the Confucians. Although there's other ideas out there in role ethics and so on and so forth that I think it's probably too technical to get into right now. But I do think that the big point is that we learn more, whether we are in China or we are in the United States, by being open to ideas and insights from around the world, rather than just looking narrowly at our own philosophical traditions.
Thank you very much. This kind of constructive response. Actually, some kind of ontology commitment for some kind of ethical life, but the Confucians are really thinking to build up some kind of effort for a kind of civil society with kind of civil religion. We still have a couple of minutes, but we have more questions. 同学叫李福学，他说：“谢谢安老师的分享。根据您的研究，儒家文化对于当下中国有什么建设性的意义？同时有什么不利的影响？”
Right. Well, I think that to some degree, I think the answer is that remains to be seen. 还不知道。So I think that the main view of Confucianism in the 20th century in China was very negative, right? The mainstream view was critical, and Confucianism was criticized for some good reason. I think that also maybe for some bad reasons, but I think it was criticized for some good reasons, because Confucianism was connected up with many practices and values from traditional society that deserve to be challenged, like gender patriarchy. And so I think the challenge for Confucianism in the 21st century, the question, can Confucianism be a constructive contributor to Chinese society in the 21st century, right? Has to do with whether Confucianism is able to become the sort of progressive force that I think it can be. Can we follow Professor Du's lead and think about Confucianism in this creative, contemporary, progressive sense? Or does Confucianism do the Confucian voices in China insist on an old-fashioned backward-looking set of ideas. And if that happens, well, then if the Confucianism that is influential in China in the next 10 years is only a backward-looking teaching about be loyal to your superiors, women do what men tell them, and so on and so forth. Well, I think then Confucianism is not playing a constructive role in China and deserves to die out. Right? So the only way Confucianism is going to play a constructive role is if it's able to continue to renovate itself, become something that deserves to play a constructive role.
Thank you. The last question, Zhang Tianwen, this friend, he or she insisted to ask, during childhood or juvenile period, we were taught with rituals or self-cultivation, but for the adults on the campus, they always misuse that, abuse that. So, so this kind of tension and complexity for the macro authority kind of penalty or kind of a judgment or kind of a control of others, but without a reflection of yourself. So his question or her question is that, how do you self-destroy the philosophy against the evil and with the conflict and more communication or more reference or more perfect with Confucian culture? Is it possible or not? You know, his question is so complicated, but I try to read her or his mind. You know, self-cultivation for others, not for yourself. That's his basic issue. But after this porch, she or he wants to fight against the adult society.
So yeah, I guess I can say something because partly the question is about what can we do in our institutions, in our colleges, in our societies to promote self-cultivation, to promote a kind of moral education. And I think that the fundamental thing that we have to keep in mind is that no one can make someone else become moral. You have to do it yourself. So the Neo-Confucians place a great deal of emphasis on 自得, right? Getting it yourself. And that doesn't mean that you're alone. You do it in relation with others, you do it with support of others, and so on and so forth. But ultimately, you have to do it yourself. And so any kind of program that's designed to promote moral growth has to be designed with that in mind. And I think there are a lot of bad ways to do this, a lot of ways that really don't work. So something that is very coercive, trying to force people, is not likely to be successful. I think we need to engage people. We need to be creative and use imagination. I think college campuses are actually really good places to do this kind of thing, but there are also challenges. By the time students arrive at college, they have matured to some degree, but they still have a ways to go in terms of really kind of figuring out. They've gotten to the point that they can begin to ask some of these really big questions. Right? Zhu makes a distinction between 小学 and 大学. And there's a degree to, the 大学 is when you're beginning to actually be able to sort of ask these big questions about how things fit together. And I think that is something that we can do in college. But it's really important that we do it in ways that encourage students to not just think intellectually about it. Go back to that quote from my President Roth. It's not just thinking about intellectually and critically. It's about how to actually engage them in their lives to take these ideas seriously, and that requires a lot of creative teaching. But I do think it's possible.
Yeah, learning to be human is the theme for the 24th World Congress of Philosophy. But some scholars said maybe it's learning to become human. It's an endless journey.
Right.
Actually, being and becoming should not be separated for Confucian philosophy. Yeah, it's a kind of continuity of being, as Professor Zhu insights. Thank you very much. I want to respect every friend to raise questions. Okay, there are the last one, the final one. 儒家学说的社会认知各种各样从研究者角度是一种传承，但从社会层面来看，有人说这是退步或者封建，不能退步到以前的形态。然后两位老师如何看待这个问题？我们应该如何传承，并被社会实践所广为推广
Right. Well,
we close our lecture.
Yeah. So I think that this is something that is a really big challenge, and it's a different challenge in every different local place. So the way that I promote Confucian values in my society, mostly right now, doesn't rely very much on talking explicitly about Confucianism. It does not help if I tell my neighbors that this is what Confucius taught. So it's more about the substance than it is about the taking them back to these ideas. I think in a Chinese context where people are much more familiar, you have a different challenge, right? Because for 100 years, most of the intellectuals have talked about how bad Confucianism is, and people, the old people and the men and so on have often used Confucianism in a bad way to just promote their own power, so there's a different kind of challenge of exciting people. They know what Confucianism is, sort of, but of exciting them about how it can really be valuable in their lives today. So I think we need more role models. We need people talking about that I'm doing this, whatever it is in your society, because it's Confucian, right? This is, because I'm promoting other people's ability to become more moral, or whatever you want, however you want to put it. So, in China, there have been a whole variety of experiments of local sorts of activities. And obviously there are lots and lots of people who are reading the classics in different ways. What's important is that they're reading them with open minds and connecting them with their actual lives, and not just trying to sort of recreate an ancient society's social order, which we should have moved beyond, right? So they need to get the right lessons from their engagement with the classics. And that takes good teachers. That takes, an open mind.
Thank you very much. We should inherit this tradition abstractly as well as concretely,
right?
and constructively. So 我们就这样吧。好，我们这个讲座就结束了，感谢各位听友的支持和热情的参与。请关注这个这边有一个二维码，大家扫一下就能够看到。好，那今天就这样了。